Think back to the last time you sat down for a large family meal. When we enjoy a traditional holiday feast on a day like Thanksgiving, we might easily imagine that humans have always eaten classics like potatoes, gravy, sweet corn. But you know what? That couldn't be further from the truth. Paleoanthropologists and archaeologists, they analyze the fossil record to reveal the myriad ways humans have cooperated to produce food across the millennia. And that fossil record definitively tells us that our human ancestors were hunter-gatherers of one variation or another for 99.98% of our 7 million year history. Put another way, even if we reduce the scope of our family tree to only modern humans, otherwise known as Homo sapiens, we've been hunter-gatherers for about 190,000 of the past 200,000 years. So, as odd as it may sound, farming, in the grand scheme of things, is about as modern as space travel and the internet. So, before we trace the origins of agriculture, let's first go deeper into the past in order to consider how humans produced food before farming came along. Now, at first thought, the idea of living a migratory hunter-gatherer lifestyle, that might sound like a horrifying alternative to those of us who rely on modern ubiquities like carry-out and grocery stores. But as renowned anthropologist Marshall Solins explains, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, it had surprising advantages beyond free rent and no bills. In fact, Solins is famously cited for describing pre-agricultural humans as the original affluent societies. These societies, which consisted of small, close-knit bands of fewer than 100 people, they lived prosperously, and they had diverse and better balanced diets. They even had longer and healthier lifespans than early farmers. Apart from avoiding delivery food and Netflix binges, foragers also avoided the high-starch, highly processed foods that most of us consume on a daily basis. Even our early farming ancestors, when they transitioned to agriculture, they suffered numerous negative nutritional outcomes, anemia and shortened life expectancy for one. But we'll get to that and the farming era soon. So, beyond their variable and balanced diet, what other advantages allowed our hunter-gatherer ancestors to live longer lives than their early farming counterparts? Well, for one, the small size of their bands made their communities adaptive and manageable. These small societies were decentralized and actually rather egalitarian with respect to leadership, work, and social class. Think of it this way. If private property is restricted to only that which you can carry, none of us will have much more than anyone else. Second of all, these small communities were migratory, and this allowed them to go where the food was. And yet, despite the upside of the hunter-gatherer life, the fact remains that humans did eventually switch to agriculture. But why is that? Well, I'll return to that important question in a few moments. But first, let's place the origins of plant and animal domestication both chronologically and geographically. The archaeological record, it shows us that humans first started farming approximately 12,000 years ago. Now, in textbooks, we often see the phrase Neolithic Revolution applied to the origins of agriculture, and the name is apt because this dramatic change in food production altered absolutely everything about our lives. And that said, most anthropologists tend to think of this food revolution as more of a transformation because the gradual shift to agriculture, it was thousands of years in the making, and it emerged in different places at different times. It's archaeologists who tell us when and where humans started farming. But how? What's the actual evidence? Well, we don't have histories written by our earliest farming ancestors, but we do have strong historical evidence. For example, if we go to the mountains of southwest Libya, we have rock art, what anthropologists refer to as parietal art. And that documents the original domestication of cattle in that region, well, some 7,000 years ago. It's as if our ancestors sent postcards from the past to help us understand our origins, right? The people who created the parietal art of southwest Libya, for example, they show us that they herded and milked cattle, and they sometimes even turned their ancient milk into prehistoric yogurt and cheese. At the Tin Nguyen site, for example, early humans recorded all kinds of daily activities in their parietal art. We see thoughtful paintings of cattle, lots of them, tended by just a few human figures here and there, and then further down the line you see a scene of people seated in small groups like a prehistoric cafe. Other archaeologists, they've analyzed pottery fragments and fossilized bones from the region to further substantiate this transition from foraging to agriculture and animal husbandry. Now, as I mentioned, agriculture emerged in different places at different times. As such, we can turn from Northern Africa to Asia, where Stanford archaeologist Li Lu provides another compelling regional example of how anthropologists date the origins of farming. Among other methods, she examines the tools of our ancestors. When Lu analyzed grinding stones from a site near China's Yellow River, she found that they dated back some 23,000 years. And that's not too far on the timeline from the coming domestication of plants. That said, starch analysis and other techniques, they show us that for thousands of years, people in this region processed foraged foods like grasses, roots, and wild millet seed. So generations of these foraging activities gradually ushered in the domestication of wild plants like millet, which became a staple for ancient Chinese civilization. So, by analyzing parietal art and early tools for food processing, well, we can even add fossilized remains of our ancestors. Anthropologists reveal the geography and the emergence of agriculture. These archaeologists, they've unearthed evidence that people in the Near East were growing cereals and figs as early as 12,000 years ago. Around that same time, we also see people in Mexico and China starting their own agricultural adventures. In Mexico, they were growing squash, playing with teosinte, the wild version of maize. Meanwhile, over in China, we start to see the emergence of rice cultivation. And genetics, they're also going to help us date the domestication of animals like cattle and goats. And what we find is that it dates to roughly the same time frame. Actually, just a little before we begin to see archaeological evidence of farming. Okay, so now we understand when and where our ancestors started farming, and we've seen how archaeologists use parietal art, prehistoric tools, and pottery analysis to trace these origins. But before we move on, why? Why, after 99.98% of our 7 million year history, did humans switch food strategies? I mean, why bother? Why didn't we just stick with the good old foraging days? I mean, think about this. As foragers, we worked fewer hours, we had more balanced diet, our population was in check, and best of all, none of us were poor or hungry. Well, that is, unless all of us were poor and hungry. So, okay, maybe we're romanticizing this hunter-gatherer lifestyle just a bit. It was actually exceptionally challenging, and it's a demanding mode of food production. But the question remains, why? Why did our human ancestors recently switch food strategies after millions of years? Why such a historic food revolution? Put simply, the agricultural transformation was a widespread human response to the changing ecological, technological, biological, and even the cultural lives of humans. Now, that's a pretty broad statement, so let's unpack it a bit by taking a closer look at a few specific reasons why some humans turned to agriculture beginning 10 to 12,000 years ago. Now, first and foremost, we evolved. Hunter-gatherers in the Middle to Late Stone Age were remarkably different from our earliest ancestors. The Middle Stone Age brain, for example, evolved to be 4 times larger than the brains of Sahelanthropus, the earliest hominin ancestor that dates back to 6 or 7 million years. Essentially, our muscles, our skeletons, the nervous system, and locomotion, they were finely tuned over millions of years for hunter-gatherer success. Now, this doesn't in and of itself explain why successful, big-brained humans switched to farming, but stick with me here. Before we get to agriculture, what about culture, right? Agriculture. Culture, our ability to communicate, to cooperate, to share, not to mention our inclination to give and receive a little help from time to time. These are foundations of humanity's survival. To get a clearer picture, let's imagine living in a small band of hunter-gatherers, let's call it 20,000 years ago. And with our brains clicking and our bodies primed, humans like us, we've become more efficient as foragers and more skilled as hunters. And even our food processing techniques and technologies, they've vastly improved. In fact, because we now know where to camp along that annual migratory passage of antelope, we can cooperate and acquire far more meat than all of us could ever eat in one session. And for that matter, we also get far more hides and useful bones that we could possibly carry. Moreover, our foraging innovation now has us collecting much more wild millet than we could ever eat or take with us. Put simply, after millions of years, we became hunting and foraging machines. Now, if you stuck with our earlier thought experiment and you're still thinking like a 20,000-year-old ace forager, you'll feel an irresistible compulsion to, well, maybe build some granaries for our surplus, granaries that we could return to as part of a migratory hunter-gatherer life, or maybe we could start building permanent or semi-permanent settlements wherever we find our most productive hunting and foraging sites. And you know what? Our pre-agricultural ancestors, they did both. And that is how bigger brains and human culture contributed to the rise of farming. Progressively, more hunter-gatherer populations were liking the idea of settling down occasionally to generate and store surplus food, tools, and all those other things that don't quite fit into a migrant's backpack. And it's my college students that relate really well to this transition towards permanent settlement, and I bet their parents do too. Let me explain. Every August, college students pack their most important belongings so they can move in to campus life. Then, after only 9 months, they repack and head somewhere else for the summer, only to return to campus 3 short months later. So, with a new dorm or apartment every year, along with 3 summers of living elsewhere, college students have annual migration patterns that discourage the accumulation of too much stuff. And like our hunter-gatherer ancestors, when a student pushes the limit on too much stuff, the people who will help him move about, well, they'll certainly offer some sharp critiques. So regardless of whether or not we chose semi-sedentary living, our direct ancestors had good and bad years, just like you and I. Our ancestors had to innovate and create new strategies to confront ecological, technical, and cultural challenges to food production. And when a regional antelope population decreased, for example, our successful ancestors, they moved on and they found new hunting grounds, or they created new ways to make a living. Now, we've just seen how our transition to agriculture and sedentary living was due in part to our evolving minds and bodies, our increasingly sophisticated tools, as well as our ability to adapt and innovate. But there was another major factor that accelerated our transition to agriculture, and that was climate change. After the most recent ice age peaked around 20,000 years ago, humans watched their hunter-gatherer worlds change dramatically. And if we return to that parietal art, our southern Algerian ancestors, they left us rock paintings depicting the Sahara as a lush, grassy expanse with giraffes, elephants, trees, streams, and lakes, right? And animal bones and geological evidence confirm that the Sahara was indeed green as recently as 8,000 years ago. But then, increased temperatures and humidity progressively dried up the once lush Sahara. But along major rivers like the Euphrates and Tigris, these changes created ideal conditions for the rise of agriculture. Similar climatic pressures challenged pre-agricultural societies all across the globe. And over the generations, humans gradually changed the way they made food. Frankly, they became farmers. Now, when we talk about hunter-gatherers, we saw how their food system influenced more than their dinner choices. Basically, the way they made food made their society, and it guided their technological, biological, and cultural development too. And the same can be said of agriculture. After nearly 7 million years of foraging, we suddenly started farming. And that food revolution, it changed our lives, all aspects of our lives, and forever. First, sedentary living and farming allowed humans to generate serious surplus, encouraging larger constructions and settlements to produce and store that surplus. We also developed innovative tools and production strategies which further bolstered our capacity to produce food. Additionally, sedentary living made it a heck of a lot easier to raise children. I mean, raising an infant is exhausting enough, even in the 21st century, with the very best of baby monitors, diaper stations, and cribs. But imagine how hard parenting would be if we were all migratory foragers. It's no surprise, really, that when folks settled down and started farming, their populations grew. No longer on the road and now capable of generating some serious food surplus, human societies eventually grew into massive ancient civilizations. We see this in China, Egypt, Peru, and all over the world. In short, the transition to agriculture inspired sedentary living and urban centers, and it sparked technological breakthroughs like writing, mathematics, medicine, and so much more. But this transition, it wasn't a smooth one. And to see why, let's turn to biological anthropology and linguistics for a revealing glimpse into our early agricultural life. First, let's head to the Illinois River Valley near modern-day Peoria for some bioanthropology. Now, in his classic text, Paleopathology at the Origins of Agriculture, George Armalagos, he analyzed fossilized remains to document early agricultural diseases. He found evidence that early farmers in the Illinois River Valley, when compared with the hunter-gatherers who preceded them, they were rather stressed out and sickly. I mean, they had bone lesions, anemia, degenerative spinal conditions, and, as I've said before, even lower life expectancies. So, despite these poor health outcomes, the relatively rapid spread of farming indicates that agriculture was actually a rather seductive alternative to the hunter-gatherer life. For example, take the Bantu, an African population bound by common linguistic and cultural traditions. In fewer than 2,000 years, the Bantu and their farming techniques took hold of most of Africa below the equator. Hunter-gatherers displaced by the Bantu, well, they either became farmers alongside the Bantu or they fled to places like the Kalahari Desert to be left alone. And we can trace this migration using linguistics to map the evolution of Bantu dialects. And you know what? This map, it shows the Bantu and their language starting near modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, and then they spread south to populate most of southern Africa. Now, before we move on to the Green Revolution and modern food production, we should discuss one more significant change spurred by agricultural life. And that's the emergence of poverty and wealth, otherwise known as private property. You know, it's like today's tech geniuses. They reap benefits from the gadgets and patents they create, and that incentivized system, right? That was in effect for early farmers too. Just think about it. Unlike the rest of us, super farmers will produce super surplus. They'll be rich, so to speak. I mean, at first, they may have surpluses due to experimental luck, or perhaps the rain and ecology in my neck of the woods just wasn't as fruitful as they were in yours. But one sure way to farm surplus was creative innovation, just like today. And for super farmers, the transition to agriculture is, in hindsight, a celebrated and transformative event. Yet, for all its glitz and glory, farming was a very risky food production strategy. I mean, a single pest infestation, inadequate rainfall, or a loose group of your neighbor's cattle, they could all ruin a farming community or a family in a flash. I mean, we see this in parts of the world even today. For example, in Mali, I worked with a family who endured several years of debt and scarcity only because one member of their family, one of their best farmers, broke his leg. Well, actually, a donkey broke it for him. But anyway, this family, it lost critical labor power for one season, and the resulting debts undermined their food security for several years. Like yin and yang, poverty and wealth always come as a pair. And like most things in life, we can find some good and bad in the agricultural trajectory that has carried us into the 21st century. And conveniently, agriculture has also carried us to the final part of today's lecture, the Green Revolution. We've seen that after the last ice age, ecological changes threatened humanity's ability to live off the land. And that crisis triggered the agricultural revolution. More recently, a second existential food crisis emerged in the 20th century. And here, in the 21st, we're not out of the woods just yet. You see, prior to the 20th century, scholars like Thomas Malthus, they rang the alarm bells. Not so different from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, modern humanity's capacity to produce food surplus encouraged population growth. But that exponential growth, Malthus believed, would eventually outstrip food production. And as a result, he warned us of a future of famine and disease. So here we are, nearly 2 centuries after Malthus voiced his concerns, these fears of runaway population growth destroying humanity. Well, they found a new voice in Paul and Anne Ehrlich's classic, The Population Bomb. Now, this 1968 book, it predicted that widespread starvation was imminent. We had finally reached our agricultural limit, and to avert a massive increase in the global death rate, humanity needed a second food revolution. But wait a minute, how do you do that? How do you make more food for more people, but with less arable land? Well, society tasks scientists, not farmers, with this new food revolution. Organized into national and international research institutes funded by government and industry, and aligned with university research programs, agricultural scientists sought solutions to feed the planet. Each major crop had its own international research program and facilities. And first through hybridization, and then with bioengineering, scientists did the seemingly impossible. They boosted yield significantly. They found ways to make more food. In the US, for example, cereal farmers used scientists' improved seed, and, well, the results were indeed revolutionary. By the start of the 21st century, US farmers more than tripled their cereal yields in over 3 decades. Early on, the 20th century food revolution, it was optimistically named the Green Revolution. And increasing food production, well, that's a monumental challenge. So if you happen to be a farmer, and if you hope to reap improved Green Revolution harvests, you're going to have to completely change the way you farm. But how? Well, first, you'll have to stop producing your own seed on the farm. You'll be buying improved seed from agricultural specialists instead. And by the way, if you're tempted to cheat the system by replanting any of that improved seed from the first generation of your improved harvest, well, you're going to want to reconsider, because since the 1990s, many of these engineered seeds carry what the world press literally calls a terminator gene, which produces sterile grain, good for eating, but bad for replanting. Now, the next step in achieving your Green Revolution yields: shopping. After buying your modified seed, you'll also need to buy fertilizer, pesticide, herbicide, some seed treatment perhaps. And you know, these petroleum-based products, they fueled the Green Revolution, and they'll allow your new seed to thrive. You see, all fields are not equal. To get the most from your improved seed, you'll need cash or credit to make conditions in your field just right. I mean, you'll definitely spend some money to get this seed in the ground, but the idea is to make up for that investment with the profits from your exponentially increased yields. And really, this is not a bad strategy as long as one can avoid unpredictable crop failure. I mean, currently, well over 80% of US soybean and cotton acres are planted with genetically modified varieties. And the first commercially produced genetically modified food, that actually hit the market quite a while ago, back in 1994. It was a tomato, by the way, which, among other qualities, has a fish gene that extends its shelf life. Unfortunately, as we settle further into the 21st century, many of the world's farmers, including the poorest of the poor, they've yet to reap Green Revolution benefits like improved yields, and, if you're so inclined, the extended shelf life of the flavor-savor tomato. But alas, as we observed, first in the agricultural transformation, Green Revolution farming benefited some more than others. Sub-Saharan African farmers, for example, grew only 1 ton of cereal per hectare in the 1960s, while U.S. farmers harvested 2. And to this day, in places like Mali, farmers still get an optimistic average of around 1 ton of grain per hectare. Nothing has changed for them. Conversely, U.S. cereal producers have harvested a stunning 6 to 7 tons a hectare, and that's since the 1990s. So, as extreme hunger and food insecurity persist into yet another century, humanity is again turning to scientists and other specialists in search of the future of food. And like early humans who brought us agriculture, today's society is faced with its own set of unique challenges, including population growth, climate change, and global security. Now, as we've seen in this lecture, anthropologists, they're uniquely positioned to explore and articulate the implications of our food production strategies, both past and future. In fact, the persistence of extreme hunger and the quest for food security, they're the focus of my own career research and much of my teaching. And as a cultural anthropologist, I've dedicated much of the last 2 decades to living and learning the quotidian lives of my remarkably generous Malian hosts. Quite different from survey research and interviews, long-term participant observation reveals to the anthropologist the words, ideas, stories, art, music, and everything else that contains the hopes, knowledge, and histories of a community. This knowledge is an essential resource for bringing technology projects into the developing world, and moreover, it can also help generate new knowledge and innovative solutions for reducing hunger. Let me give you just one example before we wrap up. 10 years ago, when I launched a collaborative seed testing and production experiment with rural Malian farmers, I spent 2 years talking with them about their lives. Once, an elder named Bakary, he literally grabbed my arm and he shook it vigorously as he told me that the sorghum plants his father once grew, he said, they're as thick as my wrist, right? The sorghum his family grows today, it's barely thicker than a pinky. And he grows these new types of sorghum because he said, those old ones, they just don't work anymore. There's not enough rain. So, years ago, when his old varieties were failing, Bakary, he traveled north to seek out new seed. You see, in the north, there's less rainfall. And so if his old seed no longer worked, he said the seed from the drier north certainly would. So to make a long story short, he brought back and shared what is now one of the most popular types of sorghum in this community. The village, in honor of this effort, named the variety Bakary Karuni Nyo, which means short Bakary sorghum. Inspired by the considerable impact of his informal experiment, I became Bakary's farm apprentice. And I also acquired 23 new types of sorghum seed for us to test. And from our experiment, I learned about local seed selection and exchange. I learned about the importance of seed names and ownership, farming techniques, labor organization, field hollers, and so much more. And as an anthropologist, I'm uniquely placed to make sense of, to broker and spread this information in a way that might ultimately benefit other farmers and scientists in other places all around the globe. Renowned 20th century anthropologist Ruth Benedict once said that the purpose of anthropology is to, quote, make the world safe for human differences. So, in terms of the history of food production, what is it that anthropologists actually know or do that might possibly make the world safer? Well, simply put, we investigate and explain the biological, linguistic, and cultural histories of humankind, including the nature and consequences of our food systems. You know, decades ago, it was Bob Marley that reminded us, a hungry mob is an angry mob. So whether you're part of the angry mob or if your belly's full, we can all make the world safer for human differences by finding ways, new and old, to feed the hungry. Today, we called upon the 4 subfields of anthropology to help us understand how food production shapes our lives and society. We even considered how anthropology can contribute to innovative solutions to feed the world. So, when you share your next meal, why not pause for an anthropological minute to appreciate the 7 million year history that put bread in your hand and tea in your cup?